Welcome, bienvenidos. I am Dr. Noe Pablo Lozano, Stanford's Engineering Associate Dean, Director, Lecturer of Student Affairs and Equity Programs. I am emeritus, and I'm also a Stanford Historical Society board member. It's a long introduction. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Planting the Seeds of Latino Diversity on the Farm with Professor Al Camarillo, hosted and organized by the Stanford Historical Society and the Stanford Humanities Center. When Al Camarillo received his PhD in 1975 from UCLA, nationally only 4 Mexican Americans received a PhD in history that year. Nevertheless, his dissertation was nominated as one of the best PhD theses in the nation for American history. A Stanford University history professor since 1975, Camarillo is widely regarded as one of the founding scholars of the fields of Mexican American and Chicano studies. He has published 8 books and dozens of articles and essays dealing with the experiences of Mexican American and other racial and immigrant groups in American cities. For example, Chicanos changing society, from Mexican pueblos to American barrios, and Chicanos in California, a history of Mexican Americans. They are seminal works. Over the course of his teaching career, Camarillo has received many awards and fellowships. He is the only faculty member at Stanford University to receive 6 of the highest and most prestigious awards for excellence in teaching, service to undergraduate education, and contributions to the university and its alumni association. As for his research and scholarship, Camarillo has received various awards, including National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship. He was also a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences and at the Stanford Humanities Center. Administratively, Professor Camarillo was the Stanford Leon Sloss Junior Memorial Professor. He was also Special Assistant Provost for Faculty Diversity. He was the Miriam and Peter Haas Centennial Professor in Public Service, the founding director of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, the Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies in the School of Humanities and Sciences, the Mellon Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies, the founding Executive Director, Inter-University Programs for Latino Research, and the founding director of the Stanford Center for Chicano Research. I'm not quite finished. All, of course, at Stanford for 4 decades. Nationally, Camarillo served as president of the Organization of American Historians and is the past president of the American Historical Society for the Pacific Coast Branch. Personally, I've known him for a long time. Al played on the UCLA championship basketball team with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, known as Dual Cinder, right? Just as important to me, though, he mentored my wife, Vida, while she was teaching here, while she was taking teaching courses here in the STEP program and a teaching credential. She went on to become a public school teacher, award-winning teacher, phenomenal, mentoring by Al. But he also mentored my daughter, Rosina, where she did her Stanford honors thesis. He continues to mentor her. She is now a professor of history at Princeton University. So Al walks on water in my house. Mi casa es su casa. What is next for Al? He just completed a book entitled Compton in My Soul, a life in pursuit of racial equity, an autobiographical and historical account of Compton from the 1950s to 2010. But now is the main event. Let's welcome Professor Camarillo. All yours, Al.
Well, I'm going to talk about several things today, tell you some stories. And parts of the storyline, of course, have to be associated with federal policies that for the first time are targeted at people who had historically been excluded from higher education. Right? So those are critically important. They also happen at a time of enormous, tumultuous times in the 1960s, all kinds of social movements. And if you're a young person in college at that time, you couldn't help but to be impacted in some way. And institutions like Stanford would be impacted by these social movements. So I'll tell you some stories about that. But it's really, it's also a story about opportunity, right? Opportunity and hope for hundreds and thousands of people here and across the country and institutions of higher education. It's about struggle. It's about struggle, but it's also about persistence, right? About those students early on, and I'm going to tend to emphasize the early years of Latino students and staff and faculty at Stanford, the 70s and 80s. But it is a story about how they persevered, right? And how, though they tried to push the institution to change a bit, they had to do it for a long time in order to make this institution change. I'm going to talk about some of the changes in the curriculum, because you can't talk about impact at Stanford unless you also talk about the changing nature of the ethnic studies curriculum, of which Stanford plays a huge role across the country today. And then I'm going to tell you something about institutional change that all of you, all of us associated with the university can take such enormous pride in. Right? So I'll come to that at the end. I'm going to draw on Frank Sotomayor's book, so we owe him a huge debt of gratitude for publishing this book. Originally, we were going to try to have Frank, who lives in Tucson, participate remotely with me in this talk, but we knew it was way too difficult. So he's watching. Frank, hello. And I'm going to reference several things from Frank's book. So in any of the stories I tell, if you want detail, it's embedded in this book, right? So it's a real contribution to understanding not only the place of Latinos and Mexican American students here, but the institution. So it's available. It's not at the bookstore, but it's available via Amazon. And I'm going to tell you some stories from this memoir that was published in July. And of course, no surprise, there are many chapters about Stanford University. This is quite, it tells you my age, but next year will be 50 years that I've been at this institution. 50 years, right? Amazing. And so that book tells the story of Stanford for a lot of years, right? That in the various things that I participated in. There were only a few in the beginning. Carlos E. Cortez, the first Mexican origin person that we know of that graduated from the university in 1905. Now, I knew about this fellow before because I'm dear friends with his grandson, historian at UC Riverside, Carlos E. Cortez. And he had told me about his grandfather coming to Stanford way back when. Now, this Cortez was a member of an elite political family in Mexico, and he came here to study. Apparently had a wonderful time and started the Spanish club at Stanford and participated in a number of other things, went back to Mexico for his career. But in 1910, you did not want to start a political career in Mexico because the Mexican Revolution was occurring. He, just a quick note on this, he was on the administration of the first elected president, Francisco Madero, who was then assassinated by a dictator. And of course, Cortez had to leave to come to California. And he spent the rest of his life here, had a family, and was involved in the petroleum industry for a long, long time. Then the first Mexican-American woman Helen Dominguez, the class of 1920, young woman from Los Angeles. Helen first went to Occidental College, and then she transferred to Stanford in 1918. Not a good year to transfer away from your home. You thought we went through a pandemic? Oh my goodness, back then. But she survived and thrived at Stanford, right? So these were the few. And I have to tell you, they were few. Maybe one every 5, 10 years, right? Until the 1960s. But they became the many. This photo here, the Latino graduating class of last year in Memorial Church. And that's just a small portion of it, right? So they went from the few to the many. But we have to understand that could not have been possible in the civil rights movement and post-civil rights movement. When the federal government got serious about creating opportunity for people that had been excluded from institutions across the land. And higher education was one of them, right? Affirmative action, as it becomes known by 1967, 1968, is a policy telling places like Stanford, you have to make efforts to diversify your undergraduate and graduate population, especially undergraduate population. And when affirmative action was put in place by the federal government, and rightfully so, it was first and foremost meant for African Americans, for good reason, right? But when you come to a place like California or other places in the American Southwest, the largest minority historically in those states are Mexican Americans and other Latinos, but at this time, they're Mexican origin. About 97% of all Spanish origin people in the Southwest in the 1960s are Mexican origin people, right? Tumultuous decade, right? Tumultuous decade. Just a few slides here to give you that. Anti-war movement is brewing, right? And gaining strength. It's impacting institutions of higher education across the country. Women's liberation movement, yet another, so a gender equality movement that is now gaining speed. A gay rights movement that is beginning to emerge. And other movements of students. So you had movements of students. North of us, San Francisco was the first of a third world liberation strike among students, spearheaded by the Black Student Union, to demand all kinds of things of San Francisco State, including representation of more African-American people of color. And they create the first ethnic studies programs in the United States. Berkeley follows the next year, San Jose State the next year, and in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of MLK Jr., at a convocation, that Provost Dick Lyman is, you can see him there, Black Student Union, it's called Take the Mic. And what do? They're making demands. They're making demands, and rightfully so. Increase more students of color. They're saying Black students, but students of color in general. And the creation of a program, a curricular program on African American studies. So Stanford, the following year, creates the first African American studies program at a private university in the United States, right? So all of this stuff is hitting home. For me, this slide here, in 1968, 15,000 Mexican American students march out of the predominantly East LA high schools to protest the deterioration of their schools in all kinds of ways. There's violence, but it's a movement of young people, right? And those of us growing up in LA at that time, I was a junior at UCLA at that time, that had a huge impact because the students, not only the college students on campuses across the country, but these high school students saying, we need change, we need reform. Now, let's come home to Stanford. I'm gonna talk about this slide because it has a lot of people in it. Some of you in this room. All right, first, want to talk about this handsome young fellow here, right? He's an amazing man, amazing man. His name is Luis Nogales. Luis, if there's one person that you point to that had in the beginning of this change at Stanford for Latino students, it's Luis Nogales. He was the first assistant to the president for Mexican-American Chicano affairs. Just quickly about him. And I want to profile him and a couple other people so that you get an idea, where did these people come from, right? The first generation of Mexican-American students ever, for the most part, as cohorts to go to institutions of higher education. Luis Nogales, the son of migrant farm working family that went up and down the valleys of California into Arizona, never going to school, the same school, switching school time after time as the family migrated from crop to crop, up and down California's interior valleys. These are the poorest of the poor in American society at this time, right? No labor protections, nothing, right? This time. So he hated it. How could you not hate it as a kid being dragged with your family and having to work by the time you're 8 years old in the fields, right? He's a smart guy. And Mama knew it. Mama only had 5th grade education. Daddy had only a 3rd grade education. But they did not want their children to have to do the work that they had been doing all their lives. They wanted different. Mama takes him out. By the time he's in high school, he's in Calexico. The family continues to do their migrant farm work on picking lettuce and in Southern California, in the Imperial Valley and into Arizona. But she said, look, you're going to live with your tío, your uncle, in the other side of the border, and he's going to go to high school in Calexico. She wanted educational stability for him. She knew he was smart. And he was doing, it took a while, but he started to really do academically. He was also a 3-sport athlete, right? He learns that education was his ticket to a different kind of life than from his parents and the vast majority of Mexican Americans at this time. He goes to San Diego State College. It wasn't university at that time, right? And he experiences a lot of problems there. 15,000 students, 10 Mexican Americans. 10 Mexican Americans. In a state with 675,000 Mexican Americans, right? Mostly in Southern California. But he begins to have academic achievement. He's in the ROTC and he does really well. And they promote him along and he graduates in 1960, I think it was 63. I may be wrong about the date. He knows he's not going to go into farm work. He wants to become what? A civil rights attorney. Applies to Harvard, Berkeley, and Stanford. And then when he met the dean here at Stanford, the dean obviously saw his talents and said, we want you to come here because we want you to help us recruit more Mexican American students. He was sold on it. So Luis comes to Stanford in the law school. And now, but he started to mobilize and organize with other students to form a Mexican American organization. It's called MECHA. This guy's a shaker and a mover, and he's incredibly smart, incredibly handsome, too, guy. Luis was a Renaissance man, right? Total Renaissance man. The day after he finishes law school, early, 2.5 years, Dick Lyman hires him as the first assistant to the president for Chicano affairs. And then Luis begins with others to lay the foundation for what would occur over the next few years. I'm just so blessed that by the time I get here, I've heard about Luis. I hadn't met him yet, but I met him shortly thereafter. And everything that everyone said about him was absolutely right. And the guy went on to an amazing career, just very briefly, because I want to highlight Luis was dealing with very serious health problems, right? I wanted to acknowledge his amazing contribution to this institution. Went on to become the first Latino on the board of trustees at Stanford University, the Ford Foundation, the Mayo Clinic, the Getty Trust Fund, and a very profitable legal practice, Nogales Enterprises, right? So Luis, oh, by the way, and to take that civil rights idea, he became a member of the Board of Trustees of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. So this man had profound impact. So that's what I wanted to highlight, right? Because he was so important to get things started. Moving the number of students that are going to be recruited. The number 71, that group of 71, Luis was partly responsible, together with the Mexican American students around him, to convince the Dean of Admissions they need to do more to recruit those students and to use the Stanford undergraduates already here to go back to their respective communities to recruit more. So in 1970, the number of Mexican American students doubled, and it would continue to rise after that. Luis was hugely important. Who are these other people? Well, there's four old professors right there. I couldn't find a picture of the three of us, Jerry, when we were young. So we were doing it. We were doing an interview for whom? The Stanford Historical Society, right? Jim Leckie in the middle from engineering. All right. The foundation is set. More students are coming. Some graduate students, relatively few, and the first faculty are being hired. Dick Lyman has the good sense, not only to work with Luis, to hire that man sitting, Artie Bienenstock, right there. Raise your hand, Artie. He was the architect, working with departments, working with schools to bring the first faculty of color to Stanford University. Jerry Porras would not be here. I would not be here. Jim Leckie would not be here. Arturo Islas wouldn't be here. Renato Rosaldo wouldn't have been. These were the first faculty of Mexican-American faculty hired at Stanford in the 1970s. And the staff. Cecilia Burciago, some of you remember Cecilia Burciago. She became, it was the third assistant to the president for Chicano Affairs, and she did an amazing job, beloved member of this community, resident fellow at Casa Pato with her husband, Tony, and family for a number of years. But that was now the building of staff. Together with this guy here, Felix Gutierrez, currently a professor in the Annenberg School of Communication at USC, but he came from LA after graduating from Cal State LA with his wife Maria to become an assistant dean, the first assistant Mexican-American assistant dean of students, and Maria became a counselor in the financial aid office, really important for students at that time. So this was the foundation. The foundation was being established. The people were being put in place. The university was changing slowly, but incrementally. A couple stories. Frank Sotomayor, when he came here in 1966-67 for the MA program in journalism. A little bit of his story now. Born on what he calls the wrong side of the tracks. In Tucson's, it was called the Hollywood Barrio. Right? There are other euphemisms. Born on the other side of the track, born on the wrong side of town. The product of what I call Jaime Crow. Jim Crow, that dirty fellow in the South that had all kinds of horrible things for African Americans, that structured the nature of discrimination and segregation for Black folks from birth to death. He morphed and came out Southwest, and he became Jaime. And though he wasn't codified in law, he was in practice and in custom, as perverse and as horrible as Jim was. Barrios, segregated Mexican American communities. The vast majority of Mexican origin people through the 1950s that lived in segregated barrios, neighborhoods, right? Racial restrictive covenants, loan policies, et cetera, or they lived in rural, what we call rural colonias, smaller communities in rural areas throughout the Southwest. This guy's a smart guy. Working class parents, dad's a gardener at a resort in Tucson. Not much education, right? But he is going to do something not a whole bunch of people did at his age. And he went to the University of Arizona and had a degree, got a degree in journalism. And Frank, because he was ready to go out and become a reporter somewhere, a journalist somewhere, because he wanted to help the family financially, of course, right? Because it was a working class family. But then something happened. His mentor in the Department of Journalism at the U of A says, Frank, there's an opportunity for you here to get an MA. I want you to apply to Stanford. He gets admitted with a scholarship, and he comes. This is really 1966. Now, here's the story. He comes here, he's getting the MA, and he's looking around campus, and there's no one that looks like him. Right? He's doing his work, and in his work as an MA student, he's getting further into grappling with the issues of the Mexican American population in the Southwest. Right? He's reading more. He's writing some of his papers about the status of Mexican Americans. And then in the spring quarter, his last quarter, he goes off to Catholic Mass in Memorial Church. And who does he meet? Luis Nogales, who is a first-year law student, and Frank Ponce, who is an MA student in English, some of the early graduate students here. And they decide together, why aren't there more of us here? So they form a little group. They're going to write a letter. And of course, as the journalist, they put Frank Sotomayor as the guy that has to, and he writes a beautiful letter to the dean saying all the reasons why there should be more Mexican Americans. Don't forget, they are the minority population in the state of California, right? They meet with Richford Snyder, the dean at the time. And he does meet with him, but he's not interested in this stuff. Not in 1966. So it goes nowhere. But it was that continued persistence over time. Luis Nogales, as he becomes assistant to the president of Chicano Affairs, is going to push forward, right? Frank goes on to an amazing career. He leaves here, he goes to the Philadelphia Inquirer, and then he goes to the Los Angeles Times, where he and his colleagues win the Pulitzer Prize in journalism for this amazing series of stories about Latinos in Southern California in 1984. Amazing guy. I wish he could be here today. Who's that little fellow over there? Who's that little guy? The Compton Barrio, where I was born, right? Because that's the only place in Compton where Mexicans were allowed to live. I didn't know that growing up, right? No blacks were allowed in Compton until the late 1940s, so there were no blacks. The only minority were Mexican Americans, small minority, and a few Japanese American farmers around the periphery of the city. How did a Mexican boy from Compton come to Stanford University? How did that happen? Opportunity, right? Luck, being at the right place at the right time, people supporting me, mentoring me. Same story that you will have heard from the Nogales parents, from the Sotomayor parents. My father did not want us to be concrete workers like him, right? He wanted better. My mother, La Jefita, she wanted better, right? I was the youngest of 6. So they had more in store for me. I was lucky to get into UCLA. I don't think they let me in because of my basketball skills. I did play basketball there. But I was fortunate to get into UCLA. 27,500 students, 44 Mexican Americans when I heard. So like Frank Sotomayor, when he went around campus looking for someone familiar, that came a few years later. Struggling mightily. Academic, my students, by the way, love this story over the years. I was on academic probation at the end of my, professor, you were on academic probation? Yes, I was. I was struggling mightily. In fact, I had to leave basketball because it was taking a huge amount of my time. I knew I wasn't going to play in the NBA. Oh, here's another funny thing with my students. Some of them learned that I played basketball at UCLA. They said, you played basketball? You're behind Kareem? I said, yes, I was once 6'10", but as you get old, the body can put, and then some of them were so gullible, they'd say, really? So I get into that place and I'm struggling mightily. And you know what turns it around for me? Mentoring and the first ethnic studies courses ever offered in the University of California system. I took the first Black Studies course, and I took the first Chicano history course ever offered in the UC system. And it was like the light went on, and I became a better student, a more engaged student. At the same time, a couple faculty took me under the wing and gave me the kind of mentoring that was necessary. And like Frank Sotomayor said, you know, we think you should stay here for graduate school. I never thought about it, which I did, right? Which I did. And long story short, 1975, the first Mexican American in the history of the nation to receive a PhD with a specialization in Mexican American Chicano studies, right? It took till 1975. My generation was the first generation to have a cohort go into these colleges and universities because of affirmative action, right? So I call myself an affirmative action baby. I'm proud to be an affirmative action baby because it was first and foremost about opportunity. And if you could gain that opportunity, it was up to you to make a success of yourself and to contribute, right? But something that was really important to me, as it was for Luis Nogales and a whole bunch of people, Jerry Porras and Jim Leckie and Cecilia Burciaga and all the others that were there, and our African-American and Asian American, Native American, our women colleagues in feminist studies and women's studies, that we knew we were the first. And we knew we had an obligation, a commitment to try to do everything we can, not only to establish the foundations of knowledge for a new field, but to change the institution whatever way we could, right? Whatever way we could, whenever we could. And it was a collaborative effort. So you had to start building programs so that as the larger number of students and increasingly a small number of faculty and graduate students forms this community, you needed programs to support those folks. One of them was Casa Zapata. Formed in 1972, the university decides to do something unique, ethnic themed dorms. Asian American, Native American, African American, Mexican American. In 1972, the Casa Zapata in the Stern Hall complex was established, and murals start, very famous murals now, right, in this dormitory, and I'm going to come back to that. El Centro, it's called now El Centro Chicano y Latino, but it starts out as El Centro Chicano in 1977. Students and faculty and staff come together and say, we need a cultural hub for our growing community. And this was true for the other communities of color on campus. And I remember in 1977, because I was part of that discussion about forming this organization, and the university agreed to do it, right? I'll share one moment, it's a funny moment. So we're in the Nitery where the El Centro is now, and we're cutting. The university said yes, we got to come up with a name, and names are being all kinds of names. And I remember one student, graduate student, he said, "Now, how about Centro Cultural Chicanos de Aztlán?" Everyone's, "Oh yeah, that's a wonderful name." And I said, "Wait a minute, guys. You're going to invite your parents in a few years, and they're going to come to this building. And on the front of the building, the acronym CACA." Oh, so that El Centro Chicano, and later Latino, because it reflects the increasing diversity of Latino origin student population at Stanford. Wonderful thing, right? It was initially almost exclusively Mexican American, over time, more different Latino subgroups. 1980, Don Kennedy, bless his heart, he was someone who really understood. In fact, I would argue, laid the foundation for the institution's commitment to diversity in profound ways. And when you remember, Jerry, when we went to him, he was the provost at the time before he became president in 1980, and we took a proposal to start the Stanford Center for Chicano Research. He said, "Let's do it. Let's do it." And luckily, we were able to get that off the ground. The other thing, too, which is really important for this institution, is that the building of the archival material to do research on the Latino experience. And when I got here in 1975, and I found out that the Department of Special Collection had the Ernesto Galarza collection, it was a huge collection from one of our key pioneers. Guess who brought that to Stanford? Luis Nogales, right? And I said, "That's an amazing archive." I'm a historian. That's what we do. We go through archives, right? We get into the sources, the primary. So I became involved in helping to develop that. But Don Kennedy and the provost, Jim Ross, at the time said, "This is getting to be quite a significant collection. Let's hire someone specifically to do this within the library." Roberto Trujillo. We stole him from UC Santa Barbara, and he's been here ever since. We now have the largest collection on the Mexican American experience in the United States in our Department of Special. Massive, massive collection. People come from all over the country, all over the world to do work here because they know this institution got serious about doing what we do, right? We provide the research materials for research and writing. Wasn't all good. It wasn't all easy, right? There were some real bumps in the road, some real struggles. 1989, students take over Don Kennedy's office because things are moving too slowly. They'd been involved in all kinds of protests, and the university saying, "Well, we've created a committee. We'll see what that committee comes up with, and then we'll try to figure out implementing recommendations." 1994, another protest by mostly Chicano students, because Cecilia Burciaga was fired from the university in 1994, let go. And they, like students before them, were demanding all kinds of things, including the creation of the first Chicano Studies program on campus. We had a program called the Chicano Fellows Program back in the early 1970s, but it was courses taught by graduate students, not by faculty, right? It was useful, but it couldn't be viewed as a legitimate program because the faculty didn't teach. This final report of the University Committee on Minority Issues, I was involved in this. In 1989, Don Kennedy and Jim Ross asked me to chair that committee. They said, "Oh, it should take about 6 months." It took 18 months. We did a 240-page report that laid the blueprint for Stanford and its diversity initiatives for the next decade, 15 years. So it was really important. Document, right, that university used to develop further its diversity programs. Out of that strike in 94, with faculty that were already talking about creating something new in higher education, in ethnic studies, we create the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and it houses for the first time all of the ethnic specific majors and minors, Asian American, Native American, Chicano, Latino, and has connections to the existing program in Afro American Studies and Jewish Studies. So it's the first program of study in higher education to do comparative and include Jewish studies within the larger umbrella of ethnic studies. So a real breakthrough, and domestic and international. Right? So all of that was really important for what? Building further that foundation, solidifying that foundation so that all students, not just students of color, but all students, graduate students, and our faculty would have the places that they could participate, the institutions, the programs, the departments, the institutes, they could participate in helping to push the institution further along the road. How many years later? In 1968, when they start the program, we think minority students are about 6.5% of the population. So Stanford got serious, right? It knew that it could play a role, not only here, but across the country, as an example of how you could create a stellar undergraduate population that's incredibly diverse, international, domestic, all the different categories of students of color, right? Multiracial students included. That's profound change. And I had such good fortune to teach thousands and thousands of these students, and they're amazing. And they've gone on to do amazing things. I mean, we'd have to have another 3-hour session for you just to mention the students that are doing unbelievable work across the country and the world. But that's change. This is change too. This is a personal perspective. All right, 1983, Casa Zapata, Cinco de Mayo. That's Jeff, our 4-year-old at the time, and Greg, 1-year-old. Class of 05, STEP program, Stanford Teacher Education Program, 8, right? Casa Zapata. This guy is the resident fellow with his family at Casa Zapata. Now that's intergenerational. All right, now I have to admit, when I got here, I thought it was really corny that people talked about the Stanford family. Wait, I came from a public institution. I came from Compton. They're a family. I learned after my wife and I were resident fellows in Governor's Corner when it opened up, and these guys were little kids in Governor's Corner. And then later, when Susan and I were resident fellows in Lantana House in the Manzanita complex, what this Stanford family really meant, there's real substance to it, right? There's real substance to it. And when you diversify that family and you can see that it works, that's amazing. I'll talk about that in just a second, closing comment. So yeah, this family, it's fun for me to go to Casa Zapata now, 50 years later, and have it be my family, right? That's a lot of fun with these group of people. All right, this is what I'm gonna leave you with. This is the face of our undergraduate population. Unbelievably smart kids that are gonna go out and set the world on fire. We've done an amazing job. So here's my argument to you. I've been thinking about, especially after writing this book. Think about this. An institution that when they started this whole initiative around 1968, it was a status quo, right? The legacy of discrimination, the legacy of racism to exclude huge segments of the American population. And it took it seriously, and over time started to build the infrastructure to make this place different. And if you listen to the president today in his inauguration, you listen to Jenny Martinez, our provost, you listen to the university leaders, they'll say one of the hallmarks of this institution is the excellence that diversity has brought to it. So here's my argument for you. And it's a wonderful thing because I take great pride in being part of this Stanford family, as all of you should. Heaven knows we need this. This is inspirational, I think, and positive. I'm an American historian of race, right? 20th century into the 21st century. We're a tumultuous time in American society. The divide is sharp. It's drastic. It's horrible. The experiment that we started 50 years ago, that people have been arguing for generations, that we try, it worked. We built at this institution a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, national, international community that works. And when you see these students and they're interacting and successfully, it's a beautiful thing. We are an example of how a multiracial society, an institution within a larger society, can work. And to all those naysayers that say, oh, we need to go back. There ain't no going back. And we'll tell you why, because we're an institution that made it work. And that gives me great sense of pride, as it should for all of you. And I'll end on that note. Thank you, folks. So we have time for some questions. Yes, sir. That's right. That's right. So that little guy that you saw there, he was an engineering student. He never used it because he went to the NFL. So class of 05, he's going to be here next week with his 20th reunion, which is really special. Well, yeah, he opted, instead of going to engineering, he got the opportunity to go to the NFL and play for 8 years in the NFL with 4 different teams. And he and his brother, by the way, another thing in the book, if you're interested, they team up. When I'm going back to do work in Compton, and they create a nonprofit organization, because Jeff, before he came back to the Bay Area, had taught in a Compton middle school for 8 years, and he and his brother teamed up to create a organization to support the pipeline of kids of color in Compton go to college, and they were pretty successful with it. So yeah, he did some football and some other stuff as well. Yes, sir.
And I think it's important for the history that while a lot of universities were engaged in trying to create and establish ethnic studies programs, under your leadership, you made a even more important ethnic studies program, because I think Stanford's was the only one that is a comparative program on race and ethnicity, whereas all the other ones nationwide are ethnic studies, or right?
Good question, Arcadio. So I call it ethnic studies 2.0, because the first generation of ethnic studies, there were basically two models: standalone departments and programs, or departments that had the 4 major ethnic group study programs within them, right? And we didn't do that early on, right? And in one way, it's too bad we didn't start those, but when we did start them in the 90s, we were able to benefit from that generation of work and understanding the models that existed in other institutions of higher education and build something unique. What's really gratifying, 12 other universities within the next 5 years after that create comparative studies of race and ethnicity, because they saw the value of what we did here, right? You're never sure that's going to work, but it's worked.
We had a related question: if there will ever be a standalone Chicano or Latin American studies, Latino studies department?
Will there ever be a separate department of Chicano studies, Latino studies? Maybe, who knows? It all depends what the faculty and the students' administration determine the most efficacious way to deliver the curriculum and organize research. So, for example, this year, the first department of African American studies. We had a Black Studies program in 1968, and now it's a department. So, we wouldn't have predicted that 10 years ago. So, possibility, you never know. But that, again, that's the determination of the faculty together with the administration and students.
Al, there's one thing I would add to your talk, and that is the enormous effort that Arturo Islas, Jerry Porras, Jim Leckie, and Renato put into identifying potential Chicano faculty. They were a spectacular group. We lost two of them, Renato and Arturo, but they really worked hard.
And good point, Artie, because they were all assistant professors, right? These were all, so, and I joined them as on their ongoing deliberations. How many meetings did we have, Jerry, when we just shake our head and say, that damn department won't consider another Latino faculty member? But in the end, we got some key people as we kept on pushing, and the university then set up ways that was going to facilitate the increase of faculty of color. It's still a big issue, right? 8% of the university's faculty are faculty of color. So that's been the most frustrating, most difficult thing to push, right? And I saw it from the inside because I became Artie Bienenstock the last 10 years of my career. So I had his job 2010 to 2018 to work with the provost and the president to seek out and hire faculty of color across the university. And we brought 16 new people in 6 years. They didn't all stay, but some of them were doing amazing work. So, for example, I was just at a dinner last night, the launch for Stanford's new institute on advancing just societies. Right? Huge development for Stanford. Stanford is now making a commitment to do something impactful, right? As it's done in so many areas, but in the area of race and justice. Tomas Jimenez, one of the people that I was delighted to help hire in sociology, is co-director. So it continues, and every one of these folks is a huge resource, an important contributor to the university. Hank, I knew you would have a question, Hank, of course.
Yeah, I do. So I'm Stanford class of 74. And my sophomore year, I had the great pleasure of living in what started out as Muir House, but by the end of the year was Casa Zapata. Although there was some question about whether it would be Zapata or Villa, Pancho Villa or Villa Zapata, which caused great fights among the Chicano residents of the dorm, some of whom's parents thought that Villa was a bandit and some thought he was a revolutionary, and some thought he was both. It was a wonderful experience, but I do remember very distinctly, it was all Chicano. Now, the campus has lots of Latinos from lots of different places, and I wonder if you have any reflections on that transition over the last 50 years from a Latino experience at Stanford, which was heavily, entirely Chicano, to one that is much more diverse.
Yeah, good question. It reflects the growing heterogeneity of the Latino origin population in the United States and in a place like California. So, as I mentioned, when I was going to UCLA, for example, 95% of the 600,000 Spanish origin people around Los Angeles metropolitan basin were Mexican American, Mexican origin. Probably a third of the entire Latino population in that same region are non-Mexican folks. So Guatemalan, Salvadorian, South Americans increasingly so. So it's a rich expansion of that population that should be reflected in the population of Latino students at Stanford. So I see it is a really an excellent thing, an appropriate thing for Stanford to understand that diversity within the Latino population. Now, that's a good question because early on it was social sciences and humanities, right? But it needs to be across the board, really. It needs to be across the board. People like Noe and others have made a huge impact in the School of Engineering. Jerry has pushed the envelope in the Graduate School of Business for decades, right? But there needs to be a wide distribution depending on the student interests, right? And that's a healthy thing.
Hi, I'm a Chinese immigrant background from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and graduated Rio Grande High School in 1967, so same generation. So when I look at the whole multicultural struggle that we've all had since we remember all white teachers, all white politicians, there was a movement to get the journalists together. If you remember the unity conferences, so we had the Black, the Hispanic, Asian, and Native American journalists, and it was building momentum up to a point. Then journalism took a hit and people didn't have jobs, period. But what I see, you mentioned the dinner last night, we're all having the same problems. And instead of having the stovepipes of ethnic groups, because ethnic studies has struggled for funding. Maybe it's not as much of a problem at Stanford, but we had the same issue about opening up Chinese and Asian American to Pacific Islander, et cetera. So if you look at all the diversity nationwide, we should be getting more political power if we build the coalition by numbers. So I just wanted to share two things. We organized as young mothers to build bilingual multicultural education. We were going in the right direction, and we got federal funding for the curriculum development centers. It all got cut off in 1980. So you know why. And you see the backlash that we have now. But if we can build back, take what you've done here and carry it back and remind people that we were going in the right direction in the 70s. Okay, so one thing, so I want to share that CABE, the California Association for Bilingual Education, has a big parent contingent now. And some of us remember, working with immigrant parents. And so if we keep building, because CABE is largely Spanish and Chinese or Asian languages. The other thing I want to share from the news yesterday, San Jose just inaugurated yesterday a political association registering voters with Julian Castro. So unfortunately, Biden's administration did not pick up a Latino or a Chinese, because Andrew Yang is very capable. But Julian Castro now is based in San Jose to register voters.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that the point the message I get from that is that progress made is not progress guaranteed, right? It constantly has to be rearticulated, reconsidered, and to not lose ground. I mean, think about what's happened in certain red states with the complete shutdown of the diversity, equity, inclusion program, like the state of Florida. I think they fired 1,000 University of Florida system, right? And basically wiped out the entire programs at every state university, and apparently there's 6 other states that are considering that now too. So it's an ongoing battle, right? It's an ongoing battle. I don't think we're going to face that in a place like Stanford, but it's a reality out there, and that's why I see it's part of this backlash, the alignment of forces to undo this, right? And you know why? Because it's been successful. It's been successful. And certain forces simply don't like that kind of success. Jerry had a question too.
I'd like to pick up on the theme again of faculty and faculty hiring. I have which I can readily admit, were very unfond memories of going around with Artie Bienenstock, talking to heads of departments and deans of schools about hiring Chicano faculty, and finding that it just didn't really have any positive effect directly. There was one example of an indirect effect, which I won't go into detail about, but it was just really kind of ineffective from that perspective. So this was back in the early 70s. The number of faculty has increased, but when you look at the sizes of those numbers, it's woefully low. They're woefully low. We've been very good at increasing the number of students at the undergraduate level. It's sort of spotty at the graduate level, but it's really good at the undergraduate level. I was wondering if, as you looked across the entire 50 years or so history, whether you see any recurring themes on why we haven't been able to increase the faculty size. What are the barriers? The barriers that were in 1972 when I started here, pretty much the same today. And that's one reason that we just really haven't reached the levels that I think are appropriate for both, representation as well as mentors for our students and researchers and so on. So are there any themes that you can see that are the barriers? And do you have any new, fresh ideas about how to overcome some of those?
Now, it's a recurring issue, Jerry, as you well know, in your school and almost every school. The trends or the messages we heard way back when that, oh, yeah, this person is fine, but not Stanford material. Right? We heard that. And it was code, right? It was code. You still hear that. I experienced some of that as I was doing the job with the provost. It takes people within departments to nudge their colleagues to say, we need to change and we need to think about changing the traditional ways we view the research and our colleagues. And we have many examples of departments and schools doing that, but not enough to really push the needle significantly. That's an ongoing for the institution, but it's not unique to Stanford. But some institutions are taking the big leap. Berkeley had an announcement a year or two ago. They were going to hire 15 people as a group. UCLA, my alma mater, our alma mater, Jerry got his business degree there. They've committed 25 FTEs, billets, as we call them, to do this work, and they're serious about it, right? So that's the next. Can we convince the university administration to say, let's renew this commitment, let's talk to those colleagues, and let's say to department or school X, you must do this. Go find the best person doing this work. And if so, we'll help you finance that faculty position. That's what it takes. And it's still hard when you do that, right? So it's an ongoing struggle.
I know you talked about Stanford, but at the same time, have you looked at what was happening with some of the Ivy Leagues with respect to this population, the ethnic population that you were representing? And the second question, sorry, is what about the local schools like San Jose State or San Francisco? What were they doing when Stanford was marching ahead with these programs?
Yeah, good question. Most of the Ivies are way behind Stanford on the Latino front. A place like Harvard invested hugely in Black studies and African American research, appropriately so, but didn't pay attention really for the most part to the other groups. So they are light years behind a place like Stanford, UCLA, other premier institutions. Probably true of the other Ivies as well, maybe not as starkly, but they have a lot of catching up to do. On the second question, there's other institutions, state institutions have made up a lot of ground in recent years. Now, a place like UCLA is on the verge of becoming a Hispanic serving institution. 25% of its student body of Hispanic origin, Latino origin, right? That's huge. When I think about there were 44 of us in 1966. But what do you do in the face of a Supreme Court that says you cannot take into consideration race or ethnicity at all in your admissions? That may really make much more difficult what universities, including Stanford at this time, is trying to figure out how to maintain some semblance of ethnic and racial diversity given the new legal standards, right? That's a big challenge, and we don't know where it's going to land. Stanford released its data, and there's been a slippage of Black students, tiny slippage on Latino students. But I fear in the long run, unless institutions get really creative and figure out how to keep diversity in the forefront of its admissions, that there'll be some losses across higher education. So it is a real challenge. Look, thank you so much, folks, for joining us tonight. Thank you.